So a few weeks ago, we published a video lamenting the fact that Hustler Casino Live, while a huge success, seemed to be moving in the wrong direction by intentionally featuring weaker players. Well, we now have to give credit where it's due, because in a recent high-stakes stream, the lineup featured one of the strongest players in the world, Mikita Bajikowski, who online goes by the name Fish2013. And in today's video, we'll be reviewing an interesting hand played between him and popular vlogger Mariano.
500.
Oh, did he call over there?
You gotta make sure you turn it.
I'm the worst. Oh no, I'm sorry.
You must have missed that move.
500 is it?
Yeah.
The aces in there.
Oh yeah, I missed that one. Bump it up to 3 large. Whoa. Let's go. Heads up.
Oh no. Top 2 against bottom set.
So Mikita flops a set, but he decides to check. This is likely in recognition of the fact that Mariano's 3-bet calling range smashes this board with straights, sets, and 2 pairs. Mikita could definitely have these same hands as well, but as the pre-flop aggressor, his advantage will usually be in overpairs, which shrink down in strength on an extremely wet board like this. And even when Mikita is holding a strong hand, Mariano's range should be quite polarized on this flop, which means the likelihood of him betting if Mikita checks should be high.
Mariano's bad night.
Given that Mariano's range should be relatively polarized on this board, he'll want to primarily use a big bet or check strategy, with his strongest hands and bluffs firing, and the middle part of his range mostly checking. And so although Mariano has top 2, equity-wise this combo is actually on the borderline, especially if Mikita is doing a lot of slow playing.
Likely gonna get a lot worse.
Okay.
Impressive second check here by Mikita.
Check is good.
So on the turn, overall Mikita should want to be more aggressive compared to the flop for a couple of reasons. First off, on the flop, since Mariano's betting range in position should have been polarized, it means that on the turn his check-back range should be relatively mid-heavy, where many of his strongest hands are removed. Additionally, this ace improves a significant portion of Mikita's range, increasing the probability that he has a set or 2 pair. That being said, when the in-position player's betting range is polar and he checks back, it also usually means that he loses a lot of his low equity hands that mainly prefer to bluff. Accordingly, Mariano's checking range should still have quite a bit of equity on this board, including plenty of ace-x. This means that although Mikita definitely has the advantage here, he shouldn't be betting his entire range, and if any portion of your range wants to check, then the out-of-position player will usually want to throw in some traps as well, which protects the checking line. And so we see that all sets, including 9s, check here with some frequency. And as for Mariano, similar to the flop, if we assume Mikita's checking range is balanced and has a good amount of slow plays, then his 2 pair will generally want to continue to proceed with caution. So although he could definitely bet here, checking is fine as well.
They're just gonna check this down?
Check.
So the river is a total brick and Mikita checks for a 3rd time. What could he be thinking here when his hand is so strong and this is the last betting street? At this point, Mikita has to be pretty confident that he's holding the effective nuts. This is because the probability of Mariano checking a straight or set on both the flop and turn in position should be relatively low. As we discussed in the last video, when you have a very strong hand, the way to optimize your EV in most situations is by placing bets over multiple streets, which gives your opponent better odds to defend with, compared to if you try to get all of your value by placing one huge bet on the river. So this means that the in-position player will usually have a strong incentive to bet his strongest hands when checked to, since he closes the action. As a result, when both players check down, typically what occurs is that the in-position player's range becomes more capped than the out of position player, who will usually do more trapping. So given this dynamic, from Makita's perspective, his sole and solitary mission should be to make the pot as large as possible, and there are two ways he could go about trying to achieve this. For option 1, he could place a bet and hope to get called by bluff catcher or even raised. Option 2, Makita could check, hope that Mariano bets, and then raise himself. Option 1 would be best if Makita thought that Mariano most likely has a mediocre hand like queens, jack X, 10x, or 9x, i.e. hands that could call a bet, but are very unlikely to bet if checked too. So if we alter Mariano's turn check back range a bit, to remove some 2 pairs and top pairs, and add a few more under pairs, we see that the straddle strategy on the river becomes much more aggressive and polarized. Option 2 would be best if Makita thought that Mariano's range was less condensed and contained more 2 pairs, ace-x, and bluffs, in which case he would be more likely to fire a river bet. So if we alter Mariano's turn check back range to include more 2 pairs and ace-x, then we see that on the river, the straddle slow plays with higher frequency. And if the button is playing a perfectly balanced GTO strategy, then all options are pretty much on the table for Makita with his set: a check, a small bet, a medium bet, or an overbet. Ultimately, Makita decides for option 2, which might be surprising to some. After all, if Mariano checked back twice on the flop and turn, doesn't it mean that he likely has a middling hand that will just want to check again on the river on this complete blank? Well, not exactly. In a vacuum, when both players check over multiple streets, there are a couple of things that tend to happen to the middle part of your range. One is that it tends to increase the equity of your strongest middling hands. This is because, as previously mentioned, each time your opponent checks, it reduces the likelihood of him holding a strong hand. Remember that equity is a relative concept. It measures the strength of your hand relative to the strength of villain's entire range. So when you're able to lop off a good chunk of the top part of your opponent's range, it automatically pushes up the rank of the top part of your range. So if we take Mariano's 2 pair, for example, on the flop it had around 69% equity. On the turn, it's slightly improved to around 70% equity, which was partially mitigated by the fact that Makita's range added sets and better 2 pairs with the ace. And on the river, facing another check by Makita, the equity of Mariano's 2 pair shoots up to nearly 93%, which means that it now has a much higher incentive to bet, especially with no further betting streets to come. The second impact of your opponent checking down is that it will typically decrease the equity of your weakest middling hands. And this is because each time your opponent checks, it also reduces the likelihood of him holding a weak hand that generally prefers to bluff, especially when facing checks. So if Mariano was holding something like pocket 5s, for example, on the flop, its equity would be around 25%. This would then lower to around 9% on the turn, and then fall essentially to 0 on the river. And of course, this means that these hands have basically 0 EV when they check back, so they should be much more inclined to bluff despite checking back on the flop and turn.
A third check with a flop set. Mario's betting now. Question is how much? Smallish.
1,500.
Oh, only 1,500?
So although we all know that Makita is holding a monster, with 3 checks in a row from Mariano's vantage point, the most probable scenario is that Makita is holding some type of marginal hand like King 10, Jack 8, or Pocket 8s that simply wants to check the showdown. And against that range, it's mandatory for Mariano to try to seek out some additional value with this 2 pair, which Mariano goes for, but interestingly, he chooses a very small bet around 20%. Now, once in a while, you will see a bet like this by the in-position player on the river on a very polarizing board like 4 to a straight, but typically small bets are most appropriate for middling hands that would just prefer to check back and fully realize instead of reopening the action. So when the in-position player bets on the river, usually he'll want to do so with a larger sizing to get significantly more value with his stronger hands due to the risk of getting check raised. And so if you have a marginal type of hand that is only moderately ahead of most of villain's range, it's often best to just check back, because if you size too large, the likelihood of getting called by worse is low. And if you try to size smaller based on the specific strength of your hand, it tends to make your cards face up and increases the probability of getting raised. So while this sort of tactic may work on the typical fishes on these streams, Makita is not your typical fish.
Huge.
Bump it up.
Yeah, I
Make
mean,
it 20 large.
I figured this was a possibility.
20,000.
So Makita makes a gigantic raise, and we see that all straights and sets, and even some strong 2 pairs, do raise in this spot, even preferring the massive 35x shove. Mariano's checks on the flop and turn and tiny bet on the river in position severely capped his range, which the solver now wants to punish.
Mariano is incredibly under-repped. Checked back, flop and turn, and bet
Had ace queen
tiny on the river.
instead of this shit. Okay. I'm gonna make the right decision. I just need a minute. It's gonna be a pretty sick clip if I make the wrong one now.
Yeah.
I'm gonna make the right decision.
Actually do this with bluffs? No.
Just give me a minute.
Show them. Maybe in theory they do.
What could he be bluffing with? Queen 10, Queen Jack, 8, 9. But does he have the balls for this?
Here we go. Now we're getting down to it.
You want me to check?
Go ahead, yeah. Go right now.
Sashimi says, do you want me to check?
Whatever, I guess it's just a cooler. Chalk it up to a cooler.
Ah, that's not the right decision.
Yeah.
So after a long tank, Mariano decides to flick in the call, and according to this sim, calling or even bluff raising to fold out better 2 pairs would have been viable. Mariano mentions that he would prefer to have ace-queen in this spot, but the solver actually prefers folding that particular combo. That being said, calling with this hand does not lose much EV either. As is always the case, river bluff catching scenarios come down to card removal, where we want to prioritize calling with hands that block Makita's value and unblock his bluffs. And in this case, there's a pretty significant overlap between cards that straddle bluffs and value bets with, which can make things difficult. On the bluff side, most of Makita's bluffs in this sim are coming from marginal hands that don't beat Mariano's top pairs plus, such as King Jack, King 9, and Queen Jack, which block both sets and straights. So holding any of these combos would, in theory, be a negative factor for Mariano. On the value side, presumably Mariano thinks Makita has a lot of straights here, perhaps because lower level players tend to mainly slow play only hands that don't need protection, which would mean holding a queen would be a positive factor. But high level players like Makita are capable of slow playing hands that can benefit from protection, so most of Makita's value actually comes from sets, which makes holding 2 pair like Mariano's Jack 10 more preferable. And in situations like this, where there's an overlap of cards that villain's likely bluffing and value betting, it's often better to focus on hands that block value, because on the river, typically there should be significantly more value combos than bluffs.